Hi everyone, this is Jamie Homemeister here, and I am going to demonstrate the 5 techniques that are in my book, Introduction to Chakragraphs, Paint Your Way Through the Subtle Bodies. So, when we're looking at something on the page, especially if it's new or unfamiliar to us, it can be a little bit difficult to follow a step-by-step tutorial just because people learn in different ways. For some people, it's like the perfect thing, right? Being able to read a set of or a series of instructions and follow those instructions at their own pace. It can be nice to have an accompaniment of a video that can demonstrate the same techniques or the same processes, so we get an alternate viewpoint and perspective on what's being asked of us or how to complete a task. So, long-winded way to say, here's some support and here's some video support that can help you with your journey. So, as you can tell, I don't know if you can see that or not, but I have got some pink water. Now, this water is not going to skew the results on my pink colors so much, but I've got it saved from a previous art project, and I left it tinted pink because it might give us a better viewpoint of where the water is being laid on the page when I work through each box. Like I said, I'm going to demonstrate the 5 techniques that are in my book, and I'm going to start with wet on wet. So because we've got a tint here, we should be able to see it a little bit better than just clear water laying on the surface of the page. So wet on wet is a technique where we lay wet water on a page, and we get wet paint on our brush, and we add that wet paint to the wet water on the page. So I'm getting my brush nice and wet, and I'm gonna paint one square. And I don't know if you can see that. I don't know if that pink is dark enough to be able to see the tint. Here's my square, and I'm getting a nice juicy sheen on this. So if we tilt it, we should be able to see a really pretty sheen on the page, but we don't necessarily want like giant puddles. So with a wet brush, I'm going to dip it into my paint. And I'm gonna use an alizarin crimson. And I've got a wet brush, wet paint, and I'm gonna add it to the wet water. So you can see this effect that happens when I lay down the paint into the water on the page, and it creates this blooming effect that's all on its own. The edges begin to feather on their own. It softens around the corners. And the paint goes to fill in the space of the water. And that's it. You add wet paint to wet water, and there's the wet on wet technique. Next, I'm gonna demonstrate the bleed technique. And this time we're gonna do wet paint on dry paper. This is called wet on dry. So I'm gonna use an ultramarine blue, and I'm gonna paint a triangle or something like a triangle. So you can immediately see that this has a harder edge. This does not have that same beautiful feather that's happening over there. And then I'm gonna take this alizarin crimson, the same color I used before, and I'm gonna marry the 2 colors. And I just bring it right to that edge, and you can see how the crimson is starting to be accepted by the ultramarine blue. And you can see how they're blooming together on their own. That is the bleed technique. The next technique that we're gonna do, or that I'm gonna show you, is wet on dry. So we just kind of practice this with this wet paint on dry paper. So I'm gonna take alizarin crimson again, just for consistency. And I'm gonna start working on a rectangle, starting at the top. And I'm just gonna go down and down and work my way down to make this rectangle. And as you can see, the color is consistent throughout. One spot isn't lighter than the other. Looks pretty even, it looks pretty consistent. That's the wet on dry technique. Pretty simple, right? Next one is gonna be super difficult, so really pay attention. It's called Diffuse. We're gonna lay down wet water, or clear water, onto our page, and we're gonna paint a square. So again, we're looking for that nice sheen appearance to it when you tilt it or look at it from a side. I'm gonna use alizarin crimson. Here we go, super tricky. Got a wet brush with wet paint. You just drop it in. So you can see how just by applying a wet drop of paint, you can get a beautiful feathering effect around the edges that you wouldn't be able to get when you do wet on dry. You get more of that hard edge. So now I can even go and take the ultramarine blue and add a second color. I can add it in the middle. I can add it around it. You can do whatever you want. But do you see how beautiful that is and how soft and sweet that effect is? This is the last technique, and it's called the layering technique. And for it, I'm gonna do wet on dry. So I'm going to get wet paint, and I'm gonna lay that wet paint on dry paper. So I've got a pretty thick coating here, a pretty thick coloring. But because we need this bottom layer to dry, I'm going to go ahead and cheat a little bit, and I'm gonna use this heat tool that I have, Nicole heat tool. It's a dryer, it's technically marketed as an embossing dryer, but it works really great just to get your painting to dry so you can add different effects quickly rather than letting it to dry naturally. When we let it dry naturally, we get a bit of a better effect. Like these, we can get a better bloom on, or we can get softer edges than if we were to go ahead and force that heat on the page. So, you know, just keep that in mind if this is something that you want to use in order to speed up your process or speed up your paintings. But here, for this purpose of this demonstration, if I touch this, parts of it are still wet. So you can see how some of that color transferred over onto my fingers. And you know, that's something that you have to be hesitant about too, or just be mindful of. If you touch your wet painting, you're gonna pull some of that color off. But in this case, because we're just doing a demonstration, it doesn't matter. So I'm gonna just crank out some heat over top for a second. Get it to dry. There we go. This little effect right here at the bottom is called a backwash. And that's where the water kind of congested in this area. And by doing so, it desaturated the paint. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and add the ultramarine blue. And I'm just gonna add it right on top of the alizarin. So you can see how the ultramarine blue, even though it's on top and it's the top layer of the color, you can still see the alizarin behind it. This is something that's really unique to watercolor. It's a unique effect where you can get that layering effect, as is the feathering that you can achieve on a diffuse stroke, or on the wet on wet look, or the bleed. So this is what makes watercolor such a beautiful media to play with. And one of the reasons why I have chosen it to work with my Chakragraphs is because it's so uncontrollable. You know, you can do whatever you want. Like, you can lay down the color and be like, yes, this is going to be just a straight wet on dry, and it should be all this consistent color. But the watercolor did what it wanted here. You know, it had this little bit of a background, and it created this little blooming effect where that color was pulled out. This is beautiful. This is a really lovely color. This is a really lovely effect, and I wouldn't change it. It's wonderful, but it's nothing that I planned for. So this is a great way for spirit to work through watercolor and to work through the watercolor techniques, because they can kind of manipulate that, you know, and I really believe that they do. And you will be so surprised at the things that your paint can't wait to tell you.